Welcome to hashtag 52 Needs, and this week we are talking about mourning. Not mourning the morning after, but mourning as grief. So I am so delighted to have with me my good friend and dedicated funeral celebrant, lifetime and end-of-life specialist, Jacqui Chaplin. Jacqui's commitment and compassion mean that a commemoration of a loved one's life will leave families and friends feeling just that little bit better on what can only be considered to be one of the most difficult days in life. Jacqui lives and breathes the various elements of her career, which include leadership coaching and in hosting a radio show about mental health matters, into an area of life that people don't want to think, let alone talk about. Jacqui seeks to make the unspeakable comfortable and make a difference to others in their most difficult days. Hi, Jacqui.
Hi, Ange. How are you going?
Great. Okay, so we were going to talk about grief and mourning, and let me just say up front, we use these words like grief, mourning, we use them interchangeably, but for me, grief is an emotion. It's a feeling that I have, whereas mourning is the process. It's how we share with others. There's ceremony like yours.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So you help people mourn.
Yes, I guess that's absolutely what I do. No guessing. That's what I do. Yeah.
We are so uncomfortable with mourning.
Oh yeah. I often talk about death literacy, and we are here in Australia, and in fact most Western nations are really lacking in the skills to deal with grief and death. And when I first started doing this work, I read as much as I could on how come that's the case and where and why. And it actually stems back to the Civil War in America.
Oh.
When there were so many bodies that had ended from the north that had ended up down south, and they needed to repatriate them, not quite the word they used back then, send them home. And the way they took care of that's when embalming first started happening in terms of the way we understand it these days. Certainly the Egyptians were doing it thousands and thousands of years ago, but we'd stopped doing that by and large in Western culture. And so that need to repatriate people home started with the embalming. And then it also meant that the transport and the dealing with the bodies and that came away from families. And then it sort of just grew such that by the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, that it had been outsourced. And around that time, hospitals also became much more the place where people would go when they were sick or to die. And that transition slowly has made it such that we don't have to deal with anything ugly, sick, death, dying. And it causes people real shock, therefore, when they are confronted with it.
Yeah. I know that, my belief system is, I don't know if life is actually final. It's like, is this the only lifetime I'm going to have, or is something happening afterwards? So I'm not really afraid of death, because why, it just doesn't make any sense to me to put energy into something I don't know anything about, and I cannot never quantify in any way, shape or form.
Certainly not going to choose to believe that there's some vengeful God or some devil I could be sent to.
No, not really. But again, everybody has their own belief systems, and I respect that.
Absolutely.
But the fact is, I still get affected by death. When somebody, and it's not about them really.
No, it's about the loss you experience. Yeah, absolutely.
So, but we don't really support people who have had a death in the family. I know that people say, oh, snap out of it, you get over it. Like the DSM-5, which is the, what is it? The
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Medicine or something.
Yes, yes, whatever it's called. In the US, is when they updated it, they said that if you grieve for more than 2 weeks, you can be diagnosed as depressed and can go on medication. I don't know anybody who can say, oh, it's 2 weeks, I can do it, except me. I did this last year. And I don't know whether I absorbed the DSM-5 through the pores and just went, oh, must be the case. But I thought
Myself 2 weeks.
I could deal with this. You know, I had a number of deaths in my environment, and I thought I'll give myself 2 weeks off, and then I'm done. No.
Funny about that, Ange. Funny about that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because you know, I know you had a lot of deaths, and that's in fact why I've stepped into this area, is because I had 5 deaths in 21 months some years ago, and a lot since then. But and those deaths were all varied, you know, from a couple of 19 and 20-year-olds through a 78-year-old, through my grandmother who was 100 and 101 days. But she was right at the end of it, and watching my family members and experiencing myself go through that, each subsequent death got harder and harder and bigger on everyone. So there is no right way. So when they're all linked together like that, it's like, well, so that's 2 weeks each for 5 deaths. So I need and it's ridiculous, because it just doesn't work that way. And I think one of the other reasons why it's so different for different people is how well you know the person, how whether you're a feeling preference or a thinking preference person, and how comfortable you are with the notion that we'll die. You know, there's a great Dying with Dignity saying which says 10 out of 10 of us will die. So we're all going to die.
Yeah.
But we're so uncomfortable with it, and we put it at arm's length. And then when it does happen, it's like a shock and a surprise.
Yeah. And again, everybody deals with it totally differently. I know that when my father died, I was, you know, my relationship healed in the end, but, you know, and I grieved. I mean, and I mourned, and I did a lot of crying. My brother, on the other hand, just kept plowing through. He just buried himself in work. Like literally had no time for anything other than work, and couldn't talk about it, didn't want to discuss it. And I have no idea how he processed that. And I know that everybody's way is totally different, and there's no right or wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
not.
like I couldn't say to him, stop working so hard, mourn our father. You know, that was his way of dealing with it.
There is no one right way to grieve. And I've actually written a blog post on that, and it says, there is only one way to grieve, and that's your way.
Yeah. And so how can we support people if everybody mourns so differently? How can we support people in mourning?
It's really, for me, that's really hard, but really simple. How can I help?
Yeah.
And I often say, when I'm celebrating a person's life or commemorating it in a funeral, it's something I probably included in some way, shape or form in every service, which is the way you keep people alive is to keep them in your hearts and your minds. And in doing so, speak their name, you know, particularly with really tragic deaths like babies or young people, or, you know, sudden deaths in really traumatic ways. Speak their name. And although the person, you know, their immediate loved ones may get really upset, they would rather you mention their name and their importance in life than never say their name again.
The thing that I also find really interesting is we've pretty much eliminated the word death. We no longer say somebody has died. We say they have passed away, they're gone, they've gone to a better world, you know, whatever it is. But as soon as somebody says this person has died, there's almost a shudder in people. Yeah, when they passed away.
And I use it, die and death, in the funeral service. And because I get families to approve everything I'm going to say, you know, in general terms, there are families who've asked me, can you not say death? Can you not say die? And other families, when I've used the alternatives, because sometimes just saying die all the way through when you're referencing someone's death, it gets a bit much. So I will, you know, left this earth, and they're like, no, don't use any euphemisms. Dead, died, stopped breathing. So there's this, and they're a much smaller percentage of people, by the way. The thing that shows up for me about that is kids and death. And when you say they've gone to a better place, so, you know, grandma's gone to a better place, and it's like, so what? Better than being with me? And so those kinds of although they give the adults comfort, they often have no idea what happens with the kids. And I remember coming out of, walking out of the botanical gardens after one particularly sad death, early death of a very, you know, well-known man. And he had sort of a cousin who had 2 younger kids, and they brought them along to the service, which is something I always encourage. Bring kids. When they talk and laugh and run around, I always just include them in the service. But as we were walking out, the father sort of dropped back behind the wife and the 2 kids and said to me, "Can you help me explain to my kids what happened to Fred?" Let's call him Fred. And I'm like, sure. It's like, "Hi, fellas. And, you know, isn't it sad about Fred? And yeah, he's not going to be around anymore because he's died." And so one of them pops up. "So how did he die?" And I said, "His heart stopped beating. He stopped breathing. His heart stopped beating. He died." That was all they needed. They didn't need to know the method of death. They didn't need to know. And, you know, that was pretty grim. But no one needed to know it. And kids certainly don't. But the more practical we can get with them, the better adjusted they come.
Yeah. So the way we mourn is really cultural. I mean, it's what's allowed, what's not allowed, what are appropriate behaviors, what are not, you know, like, I mean, again, wearing black clothes, I put this on this morning, and then as I know, it's like, okay, I wear black all the time, but it used to be the color of mourning. And when you go to Southern Europe, for example, you know, you can tell the widows because they wear black. But it used to be as an external sign, at least when I grew up. Here's somebody who's had somebody that has a death in the family. Give them space.
Yeah.
Leave them alone.
But that's also the opposite. Some people want to be left alone. Others don't. Yeah. Others just need people around them. Absolutely. And, you know, it's the, if you're stuck, just give them a silent hug. You know, put your arms out, hug. You don't have to say anything else. A silent hug can be so reassuring and so comforting. And, you know, it's really hard. And I'm very conscious as somebody who walks into houses of grieving people, which is, "How are you?" "Well, how the heck do you think I am?" And I said to one woman who I'd done a lot of funerals for her family, and I said to her, "You know, it's okay to tell people you're shit." You know,
but we don't even talk about that. I mean, my favorite expression,
doing it really hard.
People going, "I'm fine," and fine stands for fucked up, irrational, neurotic, emotionally unavailable. I'm fine.
Not sleeping, crying all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. But we are so uncomfortable with that. You know, we don't even want to hear the answer. You know, just tell me you're coping, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah, we want you to be okay, so I don't have to get messy in your grief with you. Yeah. And I've often walked into families and just gone, "How shit is this?" Now, I don't swear while I'm delivering services, even when families go, no, everyone, it's like, no, I'll point to you, you swear. But yeah, sometimes in that, you know, that raw space that you walk into, there's nothing to say but how shit is this?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I find it really interesting when I read Facebook comments when somebody has just announced somebody has died, and it's the empathy attempts are often, you know, like, that's not really helpful, you know, telling
so well-meaning though.
I understand the intention, but
yeah.
I know that, you know, when somebody says, "Oh, it's time will heals all wounds, this too shall pass," and all of that, I'd rather have somebody say to me, "That sucks."
Yeah, how shit is that?
Yeah, that really sucks. Or somebody says, "You know what? I don't really know what to say at the moment." That's mine, you know.
Perfectly reasonable.
I think that's perfect. And I actually like saying that to people. I don't know what to say. I'm just, may I give you a hug or send you some.
Got no words.
Yeah.
Got no words.
Send you a big hug, you know. And if you want to talk, or if you just want a shoulder to cry on, not even talking.
Yeah.
I'm here.
And there's a couple of people I know who've got really good at going, if, you know, flowers, don't send flowers. Like, it's such a beautiful sentiment, but when you go into houses and there are flowers everywhere, the first thing that occurs to me and often to the families is, I've got to clean this stuff up. So you end up in grief, you can't do it, and you end up with these smelly vases of dying flowers. And so it's like, send a fruit basket or send some balloons or
donate to a charity.
Yes, you know, I remember I bought a neighbor a Buddha doll, not a doll, a Buddha statue when her husband died really suddenly. And she said that was the most thoughtful outreach. It was peaceful, it was calm. I didn't have to deal with it or clean it. And it now sits by my front door and I give it a rub every time I come in, and I'll always think of you when I do that. So, you know, find something a little quirky, a little different. Flowers, beautiful
person.
Yeah, beautiful, but geez, can be overwhelming.
Because they die after a few days.
Yeah, and it's like you're just reminded yet again. And yet that reminder is also really important. You know, I
get that. And people want to contribute, but it's again, when you know somebody really well and you know that a Buddha helps, by all means, give them a Buddha. Yeah. But if you know that making a lasagna helps them, you know, make a lasagna, whatever it can be.
Or just turn up, change the bed sheets, do the washing.
Yeah.
You know, something really practical that just gets too hard to do. Wash the dishes, clean the toilet, you know, like those really things that will people let slide because they're not important, but they're also just too hard to do.
Absolutely. Really now we've talked about mourning, you know, as a mental illness that needs to be medicated. But when have you mourned enough? I mean, like, I know I'm not saying time-wise, but when can you say to somebody, do you think it's time to maybe, you know, move on? Or, you know, like,
No. It's a really interesting question, because it is so different for each of us that, you know, and in fact, I find it difficult. So my birth mother died this year, and when I talk to people about that, people go, oh, you know, I'm sorry. And it's like, that actually doesn't work for me. It's like, being sorry is not the thing that helps. Anyway, not the question you asked. So I think what shows up for me is, and I just saw this recently, is if we have a jar that is our life, and when somebody we love dies, that jar is filled with this great big dark ball of grief. Mm-hmm. And this time heals all wounds thing would then presuppose we have the same jar 6 months later, and the ball will get smaller and the ball will get smaller until it might be a speck of little pearl of grief sort of thing. But the reframe for me is the ball of grief stays the same size. What happens is you can step back out into life, because your life then becomes bigger again. So it gets really small when the grief happens, and then you get back to life. And, you know, one of my sisters, her son died very suddenly at 20, and she has not gotten over it. It has created post-traumatic stress for her.
Yeah.
Because it was so sudden and so shocking and so brutal in terms of how it happened. It was, you know, it was a basketball hoop accident, just to give people some context for that brutal thing, but brick wall falling on him. And so that for her, the subsequent deaths in our family, even though Nana was 100 years old, she responded to that death in a way different capacity than everybody else, because things were loading up on her. And it's like that, you know, the Kubler-Ross model of grief sort of comes to mind. You know, it's meant to be this, you know, bollocks. It's like scriggly, wobbly, you know, this messy.
Maybe we should explain to people what this is about, because Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said, actually, I know that people say it's a linear process, and she's actually said numerous times it's not. All of these stages can happen at any time. They can go in any order, and you can recycle. You can go from, what's the first one? Denial, shock and denial, then anger and disbelief, and then bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. But you can go into this whole accepting thing and then go into anger.
And then
go back and forth at all times. And again, I mean, if you've got several deaths happening, you know, then it becomes a, you know, that big ball gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Yeah.
So I think the notion of ever saying to someone, do you think you've grieved for long enough, doesn't sit with me. It's more about inviting them back into life. Yeah. So, you know, how about we go and have a nice dinner at that quiet little restaurant we like, or how about we go for a walk, you know, in the bush or down at the beach, or when COVID allows us to down here in Melbourne. So, yeah, I think it's about inviting them to step out, and, you know, they'll say yes or no on various occasions. But this, do you think you've grieved for long enough?
But people do say that. This is why I'm asking.
Oh, yeah. And so what I'm saying is invite them back into life. Don't tell them when they've grieved enough.
And it's an invitation, not a demand.
Oh, invitation. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I've always remember, I had one of my teachers said that he had an uncle and an aunt who were married for a very long time. And he said his uncle was the guy who liked to have a nip, you know, like he would have his little bit of something. He never went to church. And he used to swear a lot. And his aunt was really prim and proper, you know, like a teacher that didn't drink any alcohol, would go to church, you know, like the whole thing. And he said he said what happens is sometimes when you get into marriage, people occupy a spectrum. You know, one person is on one side of the spectrum and the other person is on the other one. He said he knew that his aunt had dealt with the death of her husband when he arrived one Sunday, and she was sitting on the porch having a little sherry, and said, no, I didn't go to church today. I didn't feel like it. So he said, just observe behavior. Notice when people are starting to integrate back into life and maybe even absorb some patterns or some behaviors that they didn't have before, that tell you that they have moved.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing too that I've noticed, that people in immediate grief often forget you know, your prefrontal cortex, the executive decision part, apparently looks like bunny ears, an executive decision part of your brain completely racks off in grief. Like people can't even answer their own, you know, what's your full name? What are your grandparents' names? So cutting yourself some slack on that, but they think their memories are never going to come back. And so often when you notice when they're starting to move on, because they will be able to share a memory. Oh, do you remember that Christmas? And he took his glasses off and put a napkin on his face and did Mr. Hanky Face, you know, like from the movie Holiday. And they do it with a smile and it doesn't have tears coming down the face. So yeah, there's that watching thing, Ange, you're right on it.
Yeah, good. Okay. Well, that's it for, I mean, again, we've just scratched the surface, but hopefully there's some ideas for people who are listening and watching that, you know, this is part of life. This is something that is important to us. It resets us. It helps us get back into life.
Yeah.
So thank you. Any parting words of wisdom?
Oh, no. Hug each other. Have a nice day.
Absolutely.
Wise words from Jacqui Chaplin.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. I mean, if anybody wants to have somebody who's really compassionate and knows how to farewell somebody and invite people back into life, I would definitely, you'd be the person to go to. I know that that's for me. Okay. Thanks, everybody. And I'll see you next week.